because I pushed the thing that said automatically stream out on the vertical source or destination when the other one goes. So let's see if it goes. It's not live yet. Oh,
is it a separate control panel in OBS, or is it slave to the original?
It's pretty much separate, but I don't know. We should be out on. We're out on YouTube now. Let me see. Do we have audio? Yep.
Is it a pop out?
Or is it like
in? Okay.
Well, you can move it where you want. It's a separate dock, so you can dock it where you want. But it is not actually streaming. So why is it not streaming? Maybe I didn't actually hit the setting.
You often have that issue, so I'm wondering if it's
no, it is going. It is streaming. It's streaming to the other to the real YouTube.
Okay.
We're out like right now, but it's not. I did not check the box that made it go to the vertical destination when the other one went. So let me go stream.
Johnny is saying you are much louder than me.
I am probably much louder than him. Actually, I don't know why, but let's get that figured out here. 1 second.
I can do on my end, but I could check something. Steven, I think you have the VDO.
Give me a sec. Let me hear something. Because you are coming in individually.
Yeah. Test. Are you coming in twice? Is it duplicating what you're doing? Okay, that's not it.
No, I can see in the source that you are at hovering around -25, and I am hovering around -10. So let me have a looky-loo. I did do pro audio.
I don't think I have anything that I could do.
It's all good. You are slightly quieter than normal to me, but that's okay. It could be the video. It could just be a setting. It's fine.
Windows often...
I can adjust.
Limits.
I can adjust.
I kind of miss the Windows 7 because we could individually affect the audio in Windows 7.
Okay. Can you talk again?
Yep. Testing 1, 2, 3. Test. I'm gonna have to sneeze.
I think you're still low.
Okay, sorry about that. I did have to sneeze. Oh, I gotta fix my door too.
I might have to add some gain here. Let's see. Let's go into the filters. All
right.
I believe there's a gain filter. Let's add you in here. Actually, you know what? Let me double check. I'm not stupid. No, I'm not stupidly loud at -10.
Damien, what does StreamerBot do? Testing 1, 2, 3. Just giving Steven some audio to play with. Test.
Here, I added some. Let's give you some gain, not to be confused with Rogaine. All right.
Just out of curiosity, from my perspective, where are you increasing the gain? Like if I had to do it with somebody that I was connected with, how are you doing it so I could duplicate
You're
it?
probably too loud now. Actually, 1 sec. I'll answer your question in a minute. I'm listening to it back. So
testing 1, 2, 3.
Check 1, 2. Test. Keep talking. Talk over me so I can hear back.
I'm trying to talk over you. I'm trying to talk over you.
Talk over me. Talk over me. Okay,
let's how Damien is doing with Video Ninja.
All right, I think it's close. I think they're a little off, but I think they're good. So
okay.
Okay. So you're asking about the gain. I think you're asking. Is that right?
About where you have increased gain.
So in OBS, under the audio mixer panel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, but usually I have you set as -6 and me at 0, and that gets us about even.
Okay, because I'm inherently louder than you.
Yeah, so for some reason the signal today is coming in lower. Not sure. Don't really care. It doesn't make a difference. As long as it's fine on your end, doesn't matter. I've put us both at 0 right now. And if you want to add gain, you can go to the 3 dots next to the audio source, and then you can add a filter, a gain filter. So you can reduce using the fader. You can't add with the fader. You have to add an effect, a filter.
I've noticed that in and out of my Rodecaster, it's been lower lately, because even my recordings that I just did with Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D., for instance, an hour ago, I brought it into Vegas, and everybody was like phenomenally lower than me. But my recording, both on my machine and on my PC were fine.
Well, I don't know, but it doesn't matter to me as long as there's a clean recording. It really doesn't. I just can adjust that. But I'm gonna put this here for posterity's sake that I had you at minus 6.5. That way I remember. If I need to put it back, if next week you're really loud, then I could go. What was that number again? Hello, good morning, Ernesto. Hello. Let's see. Okay, I also didn't. Clearly, something broke with the vertical plugin because I had the vertical stream key and everything in, and it went back to the old Facebook one from last time we used this. So okay, we're vertical now. Although I suppose it's actually not going out. Oh yeah, if you maximize, it goes out vertical. Cool. It's really low quality actually, but I don't know why it's low quality going out. I don't know. Don't care. That's weird.
Okay, let's do this.
Just one sec here.
I have to increase the bit rate for it.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I can do it on the fly or if it won't work. Well, you know what? It's the vertical. I can actually stop it and go back out. Let's see here. I don't know. I don't know if it increases on the fly. I have no idea with the vertical. I have not played enough with it. Oh yeah, it totally did. Yeah, it absolutely did. Cool. That's good that they have that unlocked. We might run into some issues. We'll see. We will find out, everybody. Today, I decided to retinker with vertical after it came up tangentially a few episodes ago. All right. We didn't stream. We didn't post, so did we? We'll quickly do that. I know it's 10:30. We gotta.
We'll find out when we get to the frontier.
We are.
Ding. What's that?
We
the
are
frontier.
Live. What is the frontier?
Have you ever seen Starfighter?
I have not.
Oh my god. You are such a baby.
The YouTube, I think, went out. Oh, maybe not. Did it go out? It might have gone out. That's fine.
It wasn't Starfighter. What was the name of that stupid movie? It wasn't stupid movie. It was pretty fun. It was about a kid who was playing a video game who all of a sudden had to fly a starfighter, but it wasn't called a starfighter.
I'm trying to figure out why GonnaGeek.com is not live. It's clearly a me issue because I definitely went in and scheduled it, but I'm assuming that I probably put the wrong date. What do you want to bet I put yesterday's date? Because I set it up yesterday.
Yeah. The Last Starfighter.
Oh.
You've never seen The Last Starfighter?
No.
Oh.
Oh, no. I wait a minute. Oh, I scheduled it for 3:45. That was stupid.
Which is...
There we go.
Which is in 15 minutes.
No, 3:45
right?
Pacific time.
Yeah. Well, I'll be asleep by then because, I'm old. Right, Johnny? Right? Yeah. Robert Preston? Is that who's in The Last Starfighter? Yeah, he was the Centurion. Yeah. I miss him. He was a good guy. Actually, Johnny, now that you know what I'm talking about, I actually saw a recent panel with Lance Guest, who plays Alex Rogan, and Catherine Mary Stewart. I saw a panel with them like today, this year. They're so cute and so passionate about their work in general and the industry in general. And they shared some limited stories from the filming and their screen tests and stuff. And they've never actually had a romantic connection. They found it very awkward.
Yes. I'm gonna stop the vertical. The vertical I think it's causing issues. So
oh, okay.
We'll have to retry that. I'm not sure. No. I'd like to give it a better shot, but
can you guys hear me now? Johnny, Damien, can you guys hear me now? Can you 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 hear me now? Steven, can you hear me?
I can, yes. Sorry.
Okay, good. So I know that you are receiving. Johnny, come on, I see you type.
What the hell? I'm trying to publish the post and it's not publishing.
To the gonnageek.com/live.
Yeah. It's like it's showing scheduled, but it's not actually. That's weird. There we go.
Well, you could publish as of yesterday and just.
That's what I just did. So
okay.
I think that's gonna work. There we go.
All right, let me check for you. gonnageek.com/admin. Yep, I see us.
Yeah, I don't know why that was not streaming out right, but that's okay.
Well, we'll have to do some tests.
Yep.
Okay.
And then, like, all the resources were down, but I'm just going to quickly go in and hide that.
Okay.
Stop. That way it's not on our channel.
Okay. Do you need me to do it? I can get in there pretty quick.
I'm there now. Should be okay.
Already there.
I might have stopped actually automatically.
So I don't know who else is there, but I know Johnny and Damien, you're there. Our apologies for being half an hour late, but thank you for staying with us, and thank you for coming on a Saturday. We really appreciate it. It definitely warms Steven's cold heart.
Yes, it is very cold. Okay, I didn't hide the thing, but I ended the stream. So let's do this then.
Okay.
Right. Do we want to practice the opening or just go wing it?
I'll just do the same thing I did last week.
All right. Well, we'll wing it. Hi, everybody. Oh, I didn't post threads. We are live at www. That was how we got on this better podcasting.com/live with this week's better podcasting. There we go. Okay, cool. And then I'll have to retry the stream thing after. See what's up with that. Let's go! I just thought I'd say that and then not actually do anything.
It's like, are you waiting for me?
I'm Chris from Play Comics, a show where we look at video games based on comic properties and how well they stick to that comic book source material. A part of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and the opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other wonderfully geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to episode 307 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we discuss how Steven is forcing me to give up my Saturday afternoon to podcast with him. And in this week's Better Ponderings, we discuss the fact that I am giving up special time with Katie Sackhoff and Ming-Na Wen at the Cincinnati Comic-Con. And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we talk about all the solicitors which will be pounding at my front door and repeatedly ringing my doorbell while we record. Lauren, take it away.
I want to leave it, but we should probably do a real one. But I like that. That was good. That was good.
You're welcome.
I like it. Thank you. It was a great Saturday morning. All right, you ready?
Yeah. Welcome to episode 307 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we discuss today's podcast trends versus the podcasting trends from 15 years ago.
Oh, sorry.
Which way you want to do it? I don't care.
Normal. So sorry.
Okay.
I misunderstood. Go ahead.
Welcome to episode 307 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we discuss today's podcast trends versus the podcasting trends from 15 years ago.
In this week's Better Podnerings, topics include results from our first episode of using OBS chapter markers and an update on selling gear. And hey, there's also finally only one left.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we have a listener who is looking for a replacement for a podcast service.
Lauren, we will not find a replacement for you. Start the show now.
This is Better Podcasting. We are hobby podcasters through and through, just like you. That's why we are different. We minimize the money talk so that you can focus on building a better podcast.
Welcome to a trending episode 307 of Better Podcasting. I am Steven, and I am pleased to say SP is here.
I am here, and in fact, this is my second podcast of the day because I recorded Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. earlier today, and as a quick update, Chris, aka Waffles, is still in the process of getting a new computer together. So we hope to hear from him on how that whole thing is going next week or possibly the week after. But if you have a How I Saved Your Podcast story, we want to hear about it. So get it into us at podcast@betterpodcasting.com.
And before we get into our featured segment, I just want to give a shout out. If you're wondering what is going on with our live stream situation, well, we are all over the map. This is something that we clearly said that we have some personal conflicts going on, not between us. Well, no more than usual anyways. We have some personal life conflicts going on, and so we're kind of all over the place with the streaming date. But just know, each week when we do lock it in of when it's going to be for streaming, we put it in our Discord at betterpodcasting.com/Discord. We do try to put it on social media as well, but you also need to keep in mind that we're working it out week by week through this season, and we only have a handful of episodes left because we are going to be wrapping this up in November. So make sure that you do keep listening, because can you believe we're already several episodes into the season, SB?
Yeah, and we're almost halfway there. I mean, the end of the season is coming up quick.
It's crazy. So come on over to betterpodcasting.com. You can find all of the back catalog there, and then you can come to our Discord at betterpodcasting.com/Discord. Should we trend into our featured segment?
I think we should. Let's go.
You know, SP, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking about how we might not necessarily be the OG podcasters, but we did start early on in the podcast world, starting around 2008, starting at 2008 and 2010 between the two of us, and that still makes us having been around the podcast sphere for quite some time.
Been about around the block a few times. However, during that time period, we have been witness to the changes in podcasting over the years and have occasionally referred to back in the old days here on this show when we talk about a topic. And in fact, a main part of the Better Podcasting mission since its get-go has been to keep up with the changes in the podcasting space and to do our best to inform you, our listener, or our viewer, of how it will affect you as a hobby podcaster. And while we've gone over specific areas of improvement in the past, we've never put it all together into one story and tell you what it means for your podcasting now. This episode, we're going to change that, and we're going to walk you down the road of what once was, what are the key podcasting pivot points over time, what exists today, and what you need to pay attention to in order to implement it into your show. So today's featured segment is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to. There's going to be three parts to it. The first two will be listing some podcasting trends in a sort of then versus now comparison. We picked these trends as some of the key trend highlights that a hobby podcaster may have followed in 2010, and then we'll discuss how they stack up now in 2024. Then the last section will be talking a bit about how you can take those trends as a hobby podcaster and get something out of it and why you may want to follow some of those trends and implement it into your show. So with all that said, let's get into chatting about some podcast trends circa 2010-ish.
I'll kick it off talking here about some gear. We love gear. And back in 2010, you were looking at homespun gear because even if you were embarking on a regular sort of simple podcast setup, you really back in 2010 were trying to cobble together some audio gear that wasn't necessarily designed for podcasting. This is things such as gear made for musicians or broadcasting. And this did get more difficult, of course, if you did want to work online, especially if you wanted to have multiple online participants in a way that allowed you to multi-track. That's where you found yourself building maybe a Skypeosaurus or something that was a little more complex. There were professional network tools that were available, but they really were above the means of almost every podcaster that was a hobby podcaster out there. And if you weren't associated with a major media outlet, you probably didn't even have access to some of these things there. And also, it was really hard to sometimes record in the same room together. It was something that the gear that was out there wasn't necessarily the most affordable for a hobby podcaster. And that's why a lot of people ended up choosing online.
So back in the day, Twitter, and yes, I mean Twitter, not what has become an X, but Twitter was a pretty viable place to market your podcast. There's a lot of natural engagement in the space. And as such, you could build conversation around your podcast and around your podcasting themes and topics, and thus potentially use it as marketing. Let's frame it in this way. We had multiple shows where we could just garner some feedback by posting out on the Twitter sphere, maybe just even as simple as a poll. It was so popular that there eventually became a thing called Twitter bombing. Essentially, you go out and put links to your podcast episode media for direct plays, and then it would get a bunch of traffic due to being in various feeds from bots and other accounts. Twitter bombing was ineffective for community growth. It was multiple posts per day that went back to one or multiple episodes, but it didn't have any interaction back and forth. It was a way people who only cared about the raw download. Ugh.
1 sec.
Yeah, sorry. I botched that.
Okay. I was literally in the process of my Stream Deck pedals was moved. I had it out of the way, so I was trying to find it here. Oh, why is it not working? Oh, well, that's okay. I'll fix that. Here we go.
Twitter bombing was essentially ineffective at community growth. You're just putting a bunch of episode posts out there to direct play to your podcast. But it was a way people who only cared about the raw download numbers would use it. And that's essentially people that are trying to build some stats that say your podcast gets X amount of listens, so you could have an advertiser pay you for that X amount of listens. It was false because a lot of them were bots, or there are a lot of people that just press play and then they got out of it. It was before the IAB stats came about, and it was largely responsible for the IAB statistics standards. Yes, there was other social media use, but Twitter was one of the standouts because of its easy ability to connect with others at all sorts of levels. Another trend in 2010. Go ahead.
No, sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Go ahead.
Another trend in 2010 was websites, and they required some decent technical abilities. I'll tell you this from a personal standpoint. Although we acknowledge this was a time where building a website was far easier than when you had to hand roll all of your HTML, which I did in the 1990s, the reality is it was still fairly hard to build a website for your podcast in a comprehensive manner. Oh my gosh.
That's okay.
No, the website just went.
That's okay. I'm realizing why it's early morning. I'm realizing why my Stream Deck pedal isn't working.
It wasn't plugged in.
I unplugged it. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead and say that again. Go back to the whole website thing. I think we're on both Solid or Solo.
We're on both.
Okay, go ahead.
We're on both, I think. Anyway. And moving on to another trend at the time, websites required decent technical abilities. And I know this for a fact from personal interfaces with them. Although we acknowledge this was a time where building a website was far easier than when you had to hand roll all of your HTML, the reality is it was still fairly hard to build a website for your podcast in a comprehensive manner. You were likely doing things like using a CMS such as WordPress, or potentially even utilizing data from a community forum to populate browsable episode content. Steven did that. I actually was my first podcast, Voices of Defiance, I was still hand rolling HTML. And that was a pain in the rear end because not only did I have to do the specific post, but I had to do the long website with all of the posts in there. It just was a real big hassle. And it led to me not liking website development one bit, and why Steven does a lot of the website stuff for us now, and that I don't do it. Steven will attest. They have access to the back end of Better Podcasting and Gonna Geek. Do I do some things from time to time? Yes, when I'm forced to, but I don't like it based off of that Legends or Voices of Defiance history. So if you wanted to get really integrated with your podcast in 2010, you may have had to use custom coding methods to add in podcast pieces like players. And everything was pretty square peg, round hole when it came to bridging the gap between a website and what you need to properly integrate your podcast into that website.
Now let's move on and talk about podcast directories, because do you remember a time where everyone was asking for you to please review us in iTunes? Everyone said it. Seriously, this was the standard line that you heard on almost every podcast. Why? Because really that was the only directory that truly mattered back in 2010. If you weren't in iTunes, and I say iTunes specifically that way, you really didn't have an effective way to get your podcast out to people. Also, if you were looking to get your podcast out to people, you might have looked a little bit into doing some promotions with other podcasts. You probably weren't getting significant amounts of new listeners into this space. So in order to increase your download numbers, you kind of had to look to leverage podcast listeners on other shows. Did you want to get promos from others? Did you want to engage in content on other podcasts? Well, you were probably doing some form of direct discussion negotiation with that other podcast to try to exchange those listeners a little bit. Maybe you were exchanging promos or ad reads or some form of other cross-sharing agreement. That was all being done manually. That was something you were reaching out, probably coming up with an agreement, maybe, hopefully, had a legal written agreement, or maybe it was just the word of somebody you knew. In either case, it was a lot of manual work.
Certainly was. The next trend that we're going to talk about in general, you could anticipate having a lot less commercials than you heard in radio at the time. Podcasts were a way to escape the 5-minute or now 10-minute ad break that we knew from FM radio. And if you wanted talk radio on a subject that you might not be relating to, you weren't hearing sponsored by every other news stories like you often got on AM radio. And this is a big reason why I started not only listening to podcasts, but creating podcasts, because I didn't like how my time was being subverted by all these ads. I realized that that's how they were paying to do what they were doing, but I didn't want to spend my time listening to the same ad 20 different times within 15 minutes. No, thank you. And talking about that, the formats were heavily inspired by radio and traditional audio media outlets. It's pretty clear that on some level, podcasting evolved from talk radio. And as such, a lot of the formats that you found in podcasting were very similar. There wasn't a lot of exploration done in podcasting yet, which meant that a lot of the podcasters followed what they knew, which in many cases was the traditional media such as radio.
Now, moving on, let's talk a little bit about PodCamps for podcasters, because large podcast conferences hadn't quite taken foot yet, but there were some smaller, more intimate affairs that were being done for podcasters who did want to connect with other podcasters. These were largely how-to sessions with limited, if any, industry involvement, but they were the idea that podcasters could get together with other podcasters to share or exchange ideas, best practices, things they found worked well, failures, but it still wasn't easy because you were trying to pitch out some form of conference to an industry that was full of people who were scarce and all over the map, all over the world. So definitely it was a little more intimate when you could make it happen.
Audio plugins. These are available today, but one of the ways to make audio more listenable in post-production and sometimes actually in real time is by using audio plugins into your DAW or your video editor of choice. In 2010, these were pretty limited. They could be expensive beyond the means of most hobby podcasters if you got the real good ones, or they simply didn't exist to do what you'd like them to do, like the Steven Remove plugin that I always use when I edit Better Podcasting.
That one's very valuable, high demand.
They were there at the time, plugins in general, not the Steven Remove one. Even if you were to be a little bit creative in how you technologically implemented them into your workflow, because sometimes they didn't do exactly what you needed. So you had to kind of force into something. And regardless of what plugin that you use, there was still some manual labor of going into the waveform to adjust it as best you could using whatever tool that you had at the time. So that was the state of audio plugins in 2010. FeedBurner. This is an interesting one. It still exists today, but FeedBurner was a way to control your outward facing RSS feed. And I know Steven gets into this a little bit more than I do, but at the time it was also being used to provide statistics, although nothing like the stats that we had today, because there was no IAB stats or anything like this. Unfortunately, this is a Google property, and as such has been left out to pasture for long periods of time with no attention, and it is under the constant Google threat of just throwing it into the Google graveyard. So it's hard to embrace this tool. And even at the time, it was hard to embrace this tool wholeheartedly. But at the time, it was seen as useful, if slightly fallible, tool for podcasters to implement.
Now, this next one we want to talk about is a trend that we're going to call out specifically for one piece of software. It was basically keeping Audacity from crashing. Now, we're calling this out specifically for Audacity because we want to highlight that Audacity, which is still to this day a program that a lot of people use, at the time was pain. It was very, very painful trying to work a podcast through it. There was a lot of crashing involved, but the thing that you need to keep in mind is it's a sort of representative of the time, because there were other software that people were out there trying and maybe using, but was also not as stable because it didn't have as many eyes on it as podcasting does today, that had similar pains to Audacity, just crashing when you didn't want it to crash. So you really were having to use it with saving early, saving often, manually, or else you were probably losing an episode that you had edited. But for a free resource back then, it was something that was quite available to hobby podcasters, and to this date still is quite available. And obviously, well, you know, it's improved a lot, but back then was definitely a pain point for many hobby podcasters, including SP.
Yeah, Audacity is a love-hate relationship right there, but it was a gateway for a lot of people, and it remains a gateway, even though that there are other tools out there that are free. Another trend at the time in 2010 were non-professionals with personalities and good stories. It's the essence of hobby podcasting. And because of the underground style, the history of podcast creation, podcasting was largely being run by people who had no professional broadcast history or education. That meant the odds were high. If you were put on a podcast, the probability was that you'd be listening to some average Joes talking about the subject matter and you chose to subscribe to because nobody else was talking about it. Kind of like here on Better Podcasting, talking about hobby podcasting. We're the only ones that talk about it. The hosts would lack media training. I have never had media training, although Steven, he's the polished one. And they might overuse things like crutch words and have a final product that was not very polished, might sound like echoey, like it was recorded in a cave or something like that. But really, you had no media training. You had no presentation training unless you got it through your business or leadership courses. And it was truly more of a real person and less polished, which meant that it was what was available at the time. So if you wanted to listen to a topic, you'd have to listen to the unpolishedness of it.
Next up, let's talk about podcast companies and self-hosting your podcast. When you were looking to actually put your podcast out there and host your files somewhere, there were few viable options available. Yes, you did have self-hosting, and you had some few media hosting. Oh, shoot, hold on. No, okay. I had a moment of panic. So while I was on you, it's very rainy, very windy here. My lights kind of flickered for a second.
Ooh.
And then I thought I heard a scream right now, and I was like, oh, shit. So trying to put
It's just the boys beating up on each other.
Yeah. Very cute. There we go. So when you wanted to actually put your podcast out there for the files to be somewhere, you had a couple... Oh, let me just do that. Okay. All right, so moving on, what happened when you actually wanted to put your media files out there somewhere? You had to host them somewhere, like you do today, of course. And at the time, really, you were limited to a few options. You either self-hosted them yourself, or you used one of the few media hosting companies that were out there. Yes, self-hosting was a pretty practical possibility at the time. This is because when you were podcasting, you probably were a little technically inclined, so that did translate a little bit if you were somebody who was already in the web development space. You already knew how to host files and things like that because you probably knew how to host a website. And with media host statistics not what they were today, they were very fractured, so you could get some raw logs from your web hosting provider that offered a similar idea of the traffic you were getting and the information that you could get from media hosts. At the time, there wasn't a lot of advantage in the statistics world by using a media host, which is, of course, very different today. But if you did choose a media host as your option, well, there were few reliable options that were available. We spent an entire season reviewing media hosts last season, and that lasted a very long time. Back in 2010, it might have just been a couple of episodes if we were podcasting trying to review all the media hosts that we thought were viable at the time, because there just weren't that many options available.
Probably just a singular segment, to be honest with you. And speaking of hosting companies, you had to pay hosting companies. As a podcaster, the situation was very clear. The odds were that the relationship with your media host was going to be one directional, meaning you were paying them money. There's no money coming your way from them. And audio ad revenue simply didn't exist back then. If you chose to take part of it now, it just didn't exist, especially in the amount or form that's available today. And I bring this up because I run into people on a daily basis that are adamant that they do not want to pay for hosting, and then they want to get paid for their podcast through ad revenue, which they assume is coming from the podcast media host provider. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but it is a very strong opinion by many in the industry today.
So I have a question for you, SP.
I look forward to this question every time.
What's a podcast?
Miserable pile of secrets.
If you were a podcast back in circa 2010, you might have found yourself having to market your podcast through two steps. Of course, there was the marketing steps that you might think of today, which was marketing the details about your podcast, sort of what it was about, the things that people might want to check out, why you stand out from everybody else. But there was a second major component that probably had to happen before you even got to that. And that was that just a handful of years ago, you had to educate people what a podcast was. People didn't know what it was. And as a podcaster, if you wanted to successfully market to the broader audience, you probably had to start by educating them about what a podcast even was.
There were limited special tools for podcasters in 2010. They've come a long way in recent years, but back then there was no AI, there was no text editing capability, and no auto switching for video if you even had video. This goes for hardware as well. There were no mixer recorders back then, and decent sounding USB microphones were few and far between. The industry simply had not collectively been able to focus the attention on the podcasting space, which was much smaller a market than it is now. And as far as listening to podcasts, it was mainly iPods, MP3 players, and on your desktop. And you want to listen to a podcast? This was different back then than it is now. The odds were you were listening to a podcast on one of these. These are various different pod catchers or iPods, iPod Nanos, iPod Touches, lots of different iPod stuff. And you're thinking, oh, SP, he brings these out every time. If you're on the video you saw, and he brings them out every time he talks about them. Yes, I do, because I use them even for working out. You could strap them to your arm, but this is where I store them on my desk. So they're just available to me right here. That's why you see them all the time when I talk about them. You didn't have a billion apps to download from. If you were lucky enough to have a smartphone in 2010. And quite frankly, a lot of people did listen on iTunes on the desktop back then at their desk because it was the only way they knew how to listen to it. But others, they had to download the MP3s manually for their MP3 player, or Zune player, as the MCU made popular, since the odds were they had no podcast function. And fun fact, Steven, what do you got here?
Back in the day, the way that I would, quote, subscribe to a podcast was really having to dump out the MP3 files onto a USB drive that I would then put into my car deck that had a USB port on it and then play the MP3 that way. So that was my way of subscribing and listening in the car.
It took a lot of steps to achieve, but that's how he listened to his car for a while. How I did it, in 2007, I had a Honda Odyssey minivan with a rear entertainment system, and I had a 30-pin to RCA jacks, which would include video. In order to get it into my rear entertainment center, I literally had like a 30-foot cord that was going from the iTunes to the back of the vehicle to plug in where you normally would plug in like a VCR or a DVD player or something like that. I did have an integrated DVD player into the console, but it was another way that you could even put like a gaming system in there as well. That's how I listened to podcasts until I got my Jeep in 2019. So for 9 years, that's how I listened to podcasts, was through that 30-pin to 3 RCA jacks.
That's funny. So we mentioned earlier about people who want to try to make money with their podcast, and we don't talk a lot about money making here on Better Podcasting. But if you were somebody that wanted to, back in 2010, make money, you probably were using PayPal. If you were trying to get revenue and you didn't have a PayPal donate button on your website, what were you even doing, really? Like that was really the only viable way to collect money online back in the day. And moving to another thing that we wanted to mention, which and also another limited thing that we did mention earlier, but does need to have its own category, is iTunes. The reason we wanted to say iTunes right now was from a different angle. Yes, you had to put your show in there in order to be distributed. And we want to give Apple kudos because they, of course, iTunes was a huge way that podcasting did grow. But from the other aspect of things, it really did limit your ability to get a potential audience because they had to also know how to use iTunes. If they didn't know how to use iTunes or get information from iTunes, they weren't probably finding your podcast because you wouldn't have a lot of people going on the internet and searching blah, blah, blah podcast. No, you were pretty much finding it from one location.
Yeah. And then the last trend for 2010 that we'll bring up is the average podcaster was technically inclined, or at least had an inclination to operate somewhere in the tech space. Because the origin of podcasting, it was rooted in technology. So we wanted to call this out in its own category. With all the technical requirements to do a podcast, you had to be technically inclined to put all those pieces together to go from A to Z. And that's the recording piece, the editing piece, the publishing piece, the marketing piece, the just telling anybody how to actually listen to your podcast. You had to go through a whole step thing of how to get them to your podcast. Today, you just you supply them with a link and they're able to pull it up on whatever device, whether it's a mobile device, a computer device, whatever, in order to listen to your show. It's a lot simpler today than it was back then. And that all combined into you had to have technical know-how. We have in the past talked about the fact that the people that succeeded in early podcasting knew something about music or audio. That's true. You needed to, but there was so much more than that. And it costs a lot more. And it was really, truly, I would say, a hobby for a lot of people because there was no profession that was dedicated to it.
All right, so now that we've set the groundwork here, we've implied some of the changes through the last section, that how 2010 might compare to today. Let's call out some specific trends in relation to what we just went through and the current path that podcasting is on in the year 2024. And the first is getting back to the technology discussion, which is that there's lots of plug and play gear available, and there is gear made for podcast creators. This is the recorders, the mixers, stream decks, video tools. There's so much that is available now that really is tailored towards podcasting.
As far as social media, it's gone well beyond Twitter. And I will argue that it's not exclusive, but I would say a good 90% of it is short video in all of its forms. They even surpass what we used to know in the mid-grade, the pivot point of the audiograms. Remember audiograms, Stephen?
Yes, I do.
The waveforms.
That was, oh God, it was probably only a few years ago, but I feel like it was like 20.
Yeah, like Clamor was a big source at the time that you could get audiograms. I know Headliner has been doing audiograms since its inception. So a lot of people tried different things, but those short video snippets do a lot better, even if it's something that's totally unrelated to your content. Say like playing a video game, or you're watching traffic, or you're watching some sort of a game that's not copyrighted or whatever. You see that, and then you hear audio over it and you think the two are related. They're not. And if they do a good job, they're slightly related, but actual video is so important in marketing your show. We don't do enough of it here on Better Podcasting. I know I don't do any of it on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. I do a little bit of it on Artie's Attic, and I should do more on all the shows because this is a key way forward. Also, TikTok has been the pervasive place to do this. I know there are others. There's Threads, there's Instagram, there's Mastodon, there's other places where you could, but TikTok seems to be the nexus of this video. So if you're not on TikTok or YouTube doing your video shorts, you're just not getting the marketing promotion plus that you really should be getting today. But that is a drastic change from today that existed in 2010. That sort of thing wasn't even thought about back then. Now it's just common.
Now, another thing that is common is the ease of creating podcast websites, because podcast media hosts, as you may have heard last season, generally offer some form of website if you just want to have a website for your podcast tied to your media host. So it's quite easy for a podcaster to create a website for their podcast. Of course, there is a lot of options available and a lot of pros and cons with each one, but in the end, it is easy for somebody to do generally with their media host if that's all they want to do as well. Also, with YouTube, YouTube has turned into a major distribution hub, not only for video, but also, of course, the audio now. But it does come, of course, at a cost with the algorithm, as we've mentioned a few times before. But more and more people are turning to YouTube to find their podcast. More and more people are turning to YouTube to find their podcasts. And if you are turning to somewhere to try to make money, you can sometimes turn to your media host as well.
Not exactly.
No, that's not what it is. No. One sec. And if you're looking to turn to... What was I saying? That was a good segue.
If you're looking to turn towards, in this case, I would say promotion.
Yeah. And if you're looking to try to market your podcast, you can actually buy ads fairly easily as well. Even a hobby podcaster can.
That's right. You can buy ads in apps like Podbean, Overcast, others. You can also buy it in social media, but buying the ads in the place where the podcasts are actually being played is great. You don't have to do promo swaps. You don't have to go through all the pain to do that. You could still do that, but you can just buy ads on other shows, and they may, depending on the app, they may or may not have the actual podcast, may or may not have a say in what ads actually play on their show. I would argue that if you're on a platform, I would want to be able to say nay to some ads on my show that might not be appropriate for the topic that's at hand. But for the most part, if you're in the similar space as somebody else, like if you're in the tech podcast space, you can buy an ad on another tech podcast. They'll be glad to take your money, and hopefully some of that audience will duplicate and come over to yours. So that's available now. I know it's available on Podbean and Overcast, possibly Pocket Cast. I was trying to remember all the places that you could do that, but you can do it now and get some results back from it. Or you could do it the old-fashioned way, and you could do the promo swap. So either way, it's up to you, but I would encourage you to do one or both. And another thing, talking about ads, is there are so many ads in podcasting these days. Some of the bigger shows, they roll out with 5 to 10 minutes of ads before they even start their content. This is worse than what radio was when I left it. And if you're interested in ads, there's also brand safety to consider as well. Like I said, this is what I hate about podcasting is ads. I think there are other ways to monetize, either through crowdsourcing or maybe even podcasting 2.0. I don't care what it is, but the ads are going to ruin the space. People are going to turn off their podcasts, whether it's a video show or an audio show, because they don't like the ad. They like skipping through it or paying to skip through it. And if you bake in the ad, like some YouTube videos do, if you bake in the ad, I'm going to be scrolling as hard and as fast as I can to get through it because I pay to not see ads. And I realize that you as a creator need to make money, but baking in an ad is not what I want to see.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the format of podcasting, because people are in the year 2024 starting to take some real liberties with the formats. This has changed in recent years. It's a bit of a trend that we've been noticing and kind of observing, that when all of a sudden this sort of short form instant content creation started to come out, people's attention spans and whatnot changed a little bit with what they were expecting with podcasts. So people are used to these platforms that are more bite-sized chunk information. And so you're starting to see some change within podcast formats, how people are presenting information. They're really evolving at this time. I don't think there's been an overall consistent evolution in the way that a podcast format is laid out, but there's definitely some changes that are happening in the year 2024.
And to get back to our podcast conference discussion, it's mainly based for the industry this day. There's a lot of money that's moving through the industry, and podcast movement comes to mind where they were supposed to do one show that was meant for creators and one show that was meant for the industry. That's how podcast movement evolutions, whatever, evolutions. That's what was meant for the industry, but it's all been combined, and it's just kind of the business of doing the conference. And if they can put butts in seats, they don't really care what the content is. And there are very little local podcast meetups anymore. I've thought about doing it from time to time. I simply don't have a lot of time to do it. Maybe that's why. And also in the pandemic years, like 2020 through 2023, nobody really wanted to take part in a small group like that. So I could see how that had its impact on really dampering little meetups, little local meetups for other podcasters, just to exchange ideas and to mutually support each other. We've talked about having like a mentor before on the show, and you could get a mentor in person that way, but you don't really see a lot of that. And I still maintain to this day, podcast movement is not meant for hobby podcasters. I don't care where it is, where you think it is. If it's locally to you, you're going to take time off of work during the week, and you're going to have to pay a lot of money just to get a ticket to get in, unless you can get a sponsored ticket. Like I know Buzzsprout sponsors Podfest tickets, which is a different conference in Florida. So if you live in Florida, yeah, sure, go to that. But even if you do, you're going to be taking away time and money that you could be using to improve your hobby podcasts. And if you're a hobby podcast, those are things that you are going to need to do to stay relevant. So podcast conferences, unfortunately, have moved away from the how-to helping little meetups to the big conglomerate conventions that are really meant for industry. Is it a bad thing? I think it's a bad thing for independent creators. Is it a good thing for the industry? Sure. Heck, if you're an industry, you need something like that. But the two are separate. They're not really combined.
And don't forget about the whole idea of patting each other on the back. That happens a lot of that. But moving on to our next...
I can't wait till you pat me on the back, Stephen. We've never actually met in person.
Moving on to the next two categories. They have to do with editing your podcast and publishing your podcast. The first one, talking about editors, it's it's a lot... Fuck. I'm sweary too this morning. You know, I really am.
Did the kids piss you off this morning?
I don't know. I think I have more energy this morning because it's first thing in the morning.
Did your hockey team lose last night?
Moving on, with editing, it has moved far beyond just Audacity. Now you have text editors available, for example, Descript. They're not perfect, but they are available and they are improving. So it's a different way to try to edit, and we both prefer the traditional waveform editing, but there's people out there who do use text editing, and hey, maybe as it evolves, we will end up using it a little bit more. On the publishing side of things, Podcasting 2.0 is a thing right now and deserves to have some acknowledgement. It's really helping to create RSS tags that are new. Love it or hate it, Podcasting 2.0 is attempting to bring forward new standards to podcasts with the tags like transcripts or locking the feed or other ones that have to do with money, like, you know, value for value. Although technically Podcasting 2.0 is really more than just the money aspect. The value for value is at the heart of the current movement, which is why it's kind of worth noting right now that where this goes remains to be seen. It is all over the place as far as adoption goes, so we will be waiting and seeing what happens with this, but at the moment, in 2024, this is a trend that is happening with some names behind it trying to implement this standard. So we'll come back to this in a minute, but it is on a bit of a wait and see.
Now in 2024, we have much more advanced computers and laptops and even mobile devices than we had in 2010. Editing and rendering takes a fraction of the time it once did, and new tech can enable better quality. Video comes to mind. You can get up to 4K video and do it reasonably at your desk at home. Back in the day, we were lucky to get 480 resolution, maybe 720 resolution in 2010. And it was largely on small screens, very grainy, not as bad as old CRTs, but it was pretty close with the 480. And with the new computers, new laptops, and let's face it, with new cameras like the Logitech Brio 4K, which I believe we're both using right now, that is quite the evolution to what it was 14 years ago. Okay, this next one might be a little more on the nose this time of year than you might think. I labeled it politics.
It's more on the nose for today as we record this on the 19th of October than you quite realize, but continue.
Okay, there must be some voting going on up in Canada. I labeled it politics. And I know there's a podcast out there called it, but I was just wanting to emphasize politics. Really, what we're talking about here is a lot of polished brand or subject advocacy podcasts available now. And it is a known means of distribution, so they are leveraging it left, right, and backwards. The days of unpolished hosts and shows, they're not gone. We mentioned that before, but you are going to be competing with legit professionals, people that are paid as influencers, not only to inform you of the news, but to sway your opinion. So they're going to be, their messaging is going to be very specific and very manipulative at times, but they are professionals at it. So that is what you're competing with, is professionals, people that have gone through training and advanced training for social media influencing now. And your hobby podcast is in the same space as those. Could your show be a respite from that? Yeah, but you're going to be competing with the big money that's out there to market those and promote those shows. So just want to put that out there. Yes, politics is a big subject area, but so are other subject influencing areas. So just pay attention to that. And that is what has largely transformed the industry in the past couple of years.
And yes, you're right. It is the British Columbia election today, the day we record it. So you nailed it.
What office are you running for?
Moving on, let's talk about money here. So money is the next two categories. First, with the podcast industry in general, there is big money in the space. And of course, that does come from ads. But because of the amount of podcasters out there, there is more money throughout the space that can help pay for some of this infrastructure that's required for podcasting as well. Sometimes you hear about the big money in podcasting. As a hobby podcaster, you might negatively associate with that, but we're here to also point out that, hey, money in there means the infrastructure hopefully will be around for longer times. And then on the other side of money, you can actually get paid by some media hosts, including free media hosts as well. So there is money available out there, not at the levels you probably are hoping for if you're new to podcasting trying to make money, but it is out there, which is quite the change from 2010.
Professional podcasting associations and well-known names are in the careers of podcasting today. Let's frame it this way. Even in the scope of better podcasting history, podcasting has gone from being an obscure thing to mainstream public. It was the butt of jokes, and in some cases still is if you take a look at TV shows these days. But it is a well-embraced medium by the mainstream public of officials. And some of the most well-known names in the world, or at least that they know, are in podcasting today. And it is phenomenal how somebody can go from nothing to something these days, or from a well-known name to a well-known media personality through podcasting. It's an easy way to do it. Some quick examples. Katie Sackhoff, you might know her from Battlestar Galactica or Longmire, or from Star Wars as in The Mandalorian as Bo-Katan. But she has a podcast out there and is interfacing with other celebrities in her sphere. And it is a big thing. But not only that, you have football players that have huge podcasts. And I'm talking about the Manning brothers. I'm talking about the Kelsey brothers, that it's just big in podcasting. And then you have well-known politicians that have podcasts. So yeah, there's a lot of well-known names in podcasting, but you also have unknowns like the Hawk 2 girl that is in podcasting and has gone from zero to hero basically in a matter of months. So all sorts of stuff. If you hit the right wave, you can hit it. But in general, we're talking to other people like us that are doing hobby podcasters that are talking about subjects that might not be as universal. So you're competing with those professional podcasting associations and personalities.
For the next category, we're going to talk about AI, because really there is a lot of AI generated content and clips and marketing and other things AI driven that are available right now or trending in podcasting. One example of this is transcripts. But honestly, this is a category that we want to highlight that this is a trend. This is what is trending, and it's moving in a direction, but we don't know where this is going to land. Will this end up being too costly for an average hobby podcaster? Maybe. Or will it end up being the opposite, where the AI tools end up being worth the cost because it might save a hobby podcaster a bunch of precious time? Maybe it can help you generate voice work or artifacts for your show a lot easier, or maybe it can even help streamline your editing or your production process. We'll wait and see what happens, but AI is definitely something that is trending right now.
Video consumption has evolved. It's not only on the big screen, it's not only on your big screen TV, it's not only on your monitor. It is on small screens, your mobile devices. And kids these days, yeah, I'm going to use that euphemism, but kids these days grew up with those small screens. They grew up with iPod touches. They grew up with mobile phones. This is a point where we should mention some of the overlap between what has been known as podcasting and other current trending content creation that is video based. We talked about YouTube Shorts and TikTok before. I won't belabor that, but YouTube videos or videos that are on other services like Threads or the Facebook or even X, they are trending for the new generation. It's how they're actually consuming content. There is a natural overlap with this, and this is meaning some mainstream audiences used to seeing their podcast through clips online with their favorite app. We talked about the shorts before. This means that for a full-fledged marketing campaign for your show, you need to consider how those short audio clips may end up on the phone screen, and then how you can utilize that to your advantage for marketing and promotion.
And if you are in the realm of marketing promoting, you might be thinking a bit about crowdfunding, and there are several crowdfunding services available out there, such as Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, or the ones that are on your media host, but they are available now. So if you are looking for that easy crowdfunding option, there are several choices that you might have.
There are a plethora of podcasting apps today, whereas before you'd be lucky to get iTunes. There are so many apps available now. It's really hard to know how your podcast is going to look on the other side with so many available. But this is an area that we can look to at least past trends to take an educated guess on where things are going to go in the future. We've seen podcasting apps trend upward, all of a sudden be replaced by the next one up and coming thing. With the definition and features of podcasts evolving rapidly, in some cases multiple times within 1 year, changes in the podcast sphere can sometimes cause a shakeup in what podcast app sits on top. For example, there's been a notable uptick in listeners wanting chapter markers. With Podcasting 2.0 and a wait-and-see holding pattern for this tag, that has the potential to be one of the next things that causes a shakeup in the podcast app world. For example, if they take off and some apps don't support it, that might move some people to a platform that does support it, or it could expose podcast apps that are all but dead and not innovating at all. Of course, Podcasting 2.0 may also be a trend that possibly fizzles out, as Stephen mentioned before, but we digress.
And the last thing that we wanted to mention is that, of course, almost anyone can learn how to podcast. In the current years, there's all sorts of tools and tutorials and resources that are available, which means that podcasting is relatively easy for most people to get into if you want to put a little effort into learning how. Do you still have to have some level of technical knowledge? Yes, of course you do. It's an internet-based medium, but it is nowhere near the same complicated mess that it used to be, and in general, the world has evolved to be more technical. Most people have smartphones, and there is a plethora of people using technology every single day. So the smartphone world and the way that we've evolved just has helped level up most people's technical games, which means that if you are looking to combine this with the other resources out there, you can probably confidently find a way to get yourself into podcasting. Now, with all of that said, we know what you're saying. You take it.
I'm sorry, you could have gone.
No, you go. Sorry.
Okay. So with all that said, we know what you're saying. Stephen, SP, it's fun to live in the world of podcast trends. Why do I care as a hobby podcaster? Why are you telling us all about this? Well, we do have a few opinions on this matter. Shocking, right? Us having opinions. The first is that in today's episode, I hope you recognize how drastic some things are now versus just a relatively short while ago. This is important because podcasting is still in its relative infancy. Okay. This is important because podcasting is still in its infancy relative to other mediums. This means that things can rapidly change, and if you don't come along for whatever podcast evolves into, your show might be left behind. You might find listenership and engagement drop, and we're not going to lie about it. That is deflating when that happens. But the second part of that, we hope that today's episode highlights some of the changes are not always long-term, and that means that you don't necessarily need to get wrapped up in everything right away.
If you're a long-time listener of our show,
we swear neither of us are drunk. Well, I'm not drunk. I haven't drank anything in at least 3 hours.
No comment.
I don't know.
It's 11. We started at 10 o'clock, so I'm not going to comment on that. So no.
Okay.
If you're a long-time listener of our show, you've probably heard us say many times, we'll keep an eye on this. And that's when we're talking about various podcast current events. And why do we do that so often for current event topics? Because quite frankly, we do believe that it's not always the best use of a hobby podcaster's time to try to ebb and flow with the latest emerging trends. This is because sometimes trends do fade as fast as they started to come. And we think that for a hobby podcaster, your time and money is so precious, you might as well wait and see what happens. Sometimes it's better to let all that big podcast money figure things out, spend their time and resources seeing whether something is going to be a bust, rather than you risking your time and your personal money into a personal loss. So definitely some trends are going to be better for a hobby podcaster to wait and see.
Another reason we think that trends are something that a hobby podcaster may want to think about is because, in a way, following them can be fun. It can be part of the hobby. Just like somebody who plays golf as a hobby, but also enjoys watching the latest happenings in the world of professional golf, you may want to follow the latest podcast trends to analyze, speculate, or even just converse on about with other people. Here's a fun fact for you. This podcast would not exist without a podcast trend discussion. Well, at least partially. Years ago, we got talking with each other about podcast industry advice and news, and how that evolved into discussion about points based on podcasting trends. We had a lot of fun chatting with each other offline, and through that chatter, we decided to create better podcasting. For the record, Stephen asked first, but I was within hours of asking him, just so everybody's clear about that.
I got down on one knee first.
You did. You don't have to enjoy podcast trends with others like we do, but we will say that there can be a lot of joy about discussing these things with other podcasters, especially just in a casual conversation. Talking about podcast stuff without any risk to your podcast, that can be a nice break from discussing from the perspective of bettering your podcast and having to get it done and feeling that pressure.
Another thing is podcast trends can be a way for you to sort of reflect on your own podcast and might be a jumping off point for a creative brainstorm session for yourself. If you're feeling that your podcast is a little stale, but you're having issues identifying specific reasons why you feel that way, you might want to think about how you can change it up by reflecting on established trends. Take a look at the established trends. Again, we will say that again, the established trends, not the emerging ones. How does your podcast line up with these? Are there any disconnect with the trends? Is it something that you could use these trends and try to manipulate your podcast and twist it to meet these current trends? It might fit your show, it might not, but it can be a great way for you to brainstorm about what you might be able to do to tweak your podcast to better it. So trends can be a great way that you can start those brainstorming sessions if you are looking to make tweaks to your podcast. Conversely, it can be a great way to see why you're getting lost in the noise. If your show doesn't feel unique, take a look at the trends. Are you there with every single trend, not offering anything unique? Maybe you're following the pack too much. So it can be a way for you to really reflect on your podcast. You don't have to necessarily contort or twist it to all of these things, but it is something that it can be a way to reflect on your podcast.
Finally, the last thing that we want to mention about why podcast trends may matter for a hobby podcaster is because following them may actually help you decide if you want to keep podcasting as your hobby. We love talking about podcasting because we love podcasting, but the reality is not everybody keeps their love of their podcasts over time. Like any other hobby, people's interests can grow quickly and they can fade just as fast, and that's okay. If you're not having fun with your show, keep an eye on trends that can help you figure out why. Perhaps podcasting has evolved to something that you no longer enjoy. If you find this to be the case, maybe you should consider what the current trends are and what you're not liking. Is there anything that you can not follow to make things more enjoyable? Or on the other hand, are there certain trends that you are enjoying, but you could pivot into another content creation hobby that would allow you to drop the things that aren't working for you for your podcast? We are firm believers that you don't need to feel an obligation to podcast forever. This is an area that we sometimes sound different than professional podcast coaches. They have an interest in keeping you in podcasting so that you can keep coming to them and paying them for podcast advice. But as a hobby podcasters, you should prioritize fun. And that's why we say it's okay to recognize that podcasting is no longer for you if that's the case. So if analyzing the trends will help you take what you love about podcasting and apply it to another hobby so you can keep having fun with your life, we say go for it. But perhaps you may keep a loose pulse on the podcast trends so that if they trend back to a direction that you do like, you can come on back to it. After all, you know the centuries-old adage, you can take the podcaster out of podcasting, but you can't take the podcasting out of the podcaster.
I did it, SP.
I'm so proud of you.
Let's kick off the Better Ponderings talking about something that I've been saying I needed to do for a long time. And I literally put no effort into it. And that was selling audio gear. I finally sold my Behringer MDX 2600. I've talked about this a bunch, how I need to make more effort to try to sell it. Totally forgot I had it listed on a site, on a classified site. And out of the blue, I got a message, someone that was interested, and I sold it. And I actually sold it for about 60% of my original purchase price because I got it on a great sale at the time. So, hey, so happy I sold it. It kind of makes me want to be motivated to put an active effort into trying to list all the stuff that we've talked about. Got a bunch of gear I wanted to sell, but I was so happy I sold the MDX 2600.
I've been slowly selling stuff along the way we've been talking about it, but I sometimes am really scratching my head over the stuff that's not selling. Like I had a microphone, a pretty good, $100 microphone that I had down for $40, and it just simply didn't sell. I'm going to take it offline. I'm going to actually give it to somebody as a gift, but it's just befuddling what sells and what doesn't sell. I mean, somebody bought a really crappy, we talked about it before, a microphone that I ended up making 5 cents on. It was like $19.95 and I sold it for $20, something like that. But yet I can't sell this $100 microphone for $40. So I don't know. I just don't get it. But regardless, I think it's important for both of us to get rid of the old gear and not have it accumulate over time. As you get older, you just realize that you can be that old guy that has a garage full of stuff that your kids, when you're gone, are going to have to come and throw everything at a dumpster and whatever. Or you can be the guy that really streamlines your life and keeps things going over time and keeps on modernizing, or at least everything that's useful. I mean, I'm not getting rid of any gear that's useful to me, and I don't think you are either. Matter of fact, both of us have backup plans that we still keep for that point of backup, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I did want to throw something out there on the note of gear. I wanted to see what our audience's interest was. Is I had this idea that you and I have a plethora of gear that we have mentioned that we want to sell and whatnot, but we've also had people come into our Discord and try to say, hey, I want to sell this thing. I was thinking maybe we should create in our Discord channel like a garage sale type corner, like a channel that people can go and list their stuff in there. There would be some specific rules, pricing and discussion, all that stuff would have to be through direct messages. We don't want to part in any of that, but I'm just thinking like a channel that people can go out to and see currently listed stuff that someone might be interested in. And if people are like us and have things they're like, yeah, I'd sell that if someone was interested, but I'm not going to put a lot of effort into it. Maybe it would sit around there and someone might pop in and go, hey, yeah, actually, I'm interested in that. So it was just an idea. Maybe it would be, so if you are interested, please let us know. I would like to know. This is something that I think some people might have interest, but maybe I'm off base.
Yeah, I don't want to create one unless there is actually interest for one. So if you have interest, go ahead. I don't want to be responsible for other people selling stuff. So there would have to be a big disclaimer on it that we're not responsible for any private sales that are ongoing, but it would give the people the opportunity to actually sell gear. Just buyer be warned, I guess, at that point. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I also, on a last note, I don't know if I told you this or not, but remember that rebuilt BCD1 that I had?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sold for $5.
Sweet. Well, there you go.
At least it's out of the house.
The next thing I wanted to mention here was last episode, I started using the OBS chapter markers, and it was a resounding success. I have to say, I was super happy with the results. This is where, through OBS, I can go in and I can stamp time in the video, and I've pre-programmed some descriptions, and then when I pull it into my video editor, they're all there ready to go. This is how I usually edit. It's typing out the different points that I need to go in and edit, but I also coupled it with a timestamp plugin for the Stream Deck so that I am basically having redundancy. because if OBS fails, then hopefully the Stream Deck will be there with that same information that I can go and reference. So they both worked actually quite well. I didn't see any issues with either. I did a quick check to see if they both seem to be reflective of the same thing. They seem to be. But yeah, bringing those time codes in to DaVinci Resolve was fantastic. And I cannot wait for continued use of this, just because it lines up so well with my editing flow. So I was very happy about that.
It does. It does not line up with my editing flow whatsoever. So unfortunately, at best, I'd be able to put edit point, edit point, edit point, edit point in, and not maybe individual things. And that wouldn't catch everything that I end up editing. So I don't know. I don't know if it'll work for me or not. I might try it just because, right? Would like to get a Stream Deck first. And I don't think we talked about it on the show or not, but now that I'm doing a different workflow, which we'll talk about in a second, that might happen.
You know how you could use it though? If you had something that you wanted to tag for that social media thing that we talked about earlier, you could start putting markers in there of when there was a clip that you thought was clippable. So
yeah, and then pull those out first before I do the edit. Yeah.
Okay. There's actually an OBS feature that would make it even easier, but that's not the point we're talking about right now. So
you just want me to get a Stream Deck.
You also had a big change as far as your Libsyn exodus went, right?
Yeah, the podcast host that shall not be named anymore. The last time we spoke, I was charging through and trying to verify, validate, and update my Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. feed. And in order to do that, I still needed the podcast host that shall not be named database. Basically, it wasn't a feed at the time, but really a database up. I was able to update the feed on StreamYard or on Pinecast, not StreamYard, Pinecast. And I was able to then cancel my podcast host that shall not be named account for that show. That means out of the 5 shows that I was paying for, I only have 1 left on that podcast media host. Unfortunately, since there are 263 episodes and it is not an active show, it's going to take me a little bit to get through it. I'm not going to be as active. There's other stuff that I have to do. I was working hours and hours per day on this to get it done. And I finally got it done. I should have timed myself with the total time that it took to update the feed on Pinecast. But because of that, I am not committing to a time period yet with Starling Tribune. I will be doing it, but it will be at a much slower pace than I did with Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. But as of now, 4 of my 5 shows are now gone from that podcast media host provider. And regardless of what you might hear in the news or anything, my opinions on that business, on that service remain. It hasn't changed at all. There might have been some personnel movements, but the fact that the tech debt is still there, the fact that they are broken between the 4 and the 5 of their software version, the fact that they still have personnel that berate other personnel. There was just a notification on that on our Discord server this week. I cannot recommend that business anymore and won't until some major things change. And I don't know if that'll ever be the case. So, I am still very much, there's no buyer's remorse here of moving away from that business. I am still full steam ahead, getting off of that business onto something else.
So that's going to do it for the Better Podnerings this week. Should we get into the Better Pod back?
Yeah, let's see what everybody else had to say.
This is where we here at Better Podcasting turn the show over to you as we run through some of your feedback. We call this segment Better Pod Back.
Over in our Discord, we had Randy comment on you talking about using Video Ninja. Actually, no, sorry. Let me re-edit that. Over in our Discord, we had Randy Walker comment on you posting about canceling your StreamYard subscription. And Randy said, does this mean you're 100% settled on an alternative? So what's the deal?
Yeah, I was settled on a workable solution for now. I was not interested in paying StreamYard the 400% increase. I was going from $10 a month to $50 a month underneath their new construct. So I wasn't interested in that. So I found an alternative. I'll talk about that in a second. And when I was canceling my StreamYard account, which I had to do I did it Thursday night because the next day would be the billing cycle. I canceled that 2 days ago because I had another workable solution and didn't want to pay. The other workable solution is what we've been doing on Better Podcasting and what we've been doing on Gonna Geek for quite some time. I would say years, actually, Stephen. I don't know when you started doing it. I have not been on the production side of things before. Stephen has always been the producer. I've always been a user, but I've always been a proponent of it. And that is using the connection of Video.Ninja and the recording capability, and I'll call it a streaming capability, even though I'm not really using it that way right now, of OBS to do the same thing for the most part that I was doing on StreamYard. And I'm doing it for free. As we talked about it before in an earlier episode, I can't remember if that was last week or the week before, there is an ability to give Video.Ninja some money in compensation for the service, mostly as a contribution, as a gift sort of thing, not really a subscription payment. So I still have to look into that, but it is way better than me paying the $50 per month for StreamYard. Is StreamYard worth $50 a month if you were like a professional setting or something like that? Maybe, but I still think it's a little bit overpriced for what it is. And they could offer a reduced capability for even $20 a month. But when I canceled it, they said, oh, we'll give you 6 months at 40% off. I'm still like, that's $30 a month. I'm just not interested in paying $30 a month for 6 months, knowing that in 6 months it's going to go up. So I'm just going to take the hit right now. I've successfully done it for a couple of weeks now. I'm going to use Video.Ninja and OBS. I'm just not going to worry about it. Could I go back to StreamYard or Restream or, whatever, Riverside? Could I do that? Yeah. At a drop of a hat, I could, get in there, start up an account and be up and running probably within an hour. So I'm not really worried about if Video.Ninja and OBS tank on me at any given time. I always have those backups of paying for a month with one of those services.
Also, we did have Yakko come in and say StreamYard can now export to a few video editors. We usually can't record individual video because our Canadian host has horrible upload speeds. Damn Canadians. But he was in a turkey coma last night and wasn't on the show. So far, it's nice. You get the combined video and tracks for each host, plus the interstitials, thank you, that might be played in the show. We'll see how it helps with editing. So this is a feature that Yakko came across, and we look forward to hearing more because neither of us are using it anymore. So hopefully you will give us some more information.
But I did use it earlier this year. I know what he's talking about, the individual video track. This depends on the internet speed and the computing power of your co-hosts or guests. If they don't have the speed necessary or the computing power necessary to really pull this off, then what you're going to end up doing is hampering yourself more than helping yourself in the end. It's just people's machines will bog up and you won't get the full recording. It's happened over and over again. I see the posts on Reddit all the time, and it's not just limited to StreamYard. It could be Riverside. It could be any of them out there. So yes, I realize it's a great capability. I have used it. And if you're paying for it and it's part of your budget, go for it. I get it. But I'm just not interested in doing that. It's not, my shows, unfortunately, are not at the level where I really need that capability.
All right, so earlier we talked about the chapter markers. Well, we had Scatmaker actually, coincidentally, after I had that on the Better Podnerings, come into our Discord and say, how have the markers been working for you? So I wanted to call this out. Number one, Scatmaker, thank you so much for asking. I appreciate you originally telling me about it and for asking a follow-up, but I kept a little bit of news because I figured it worked a little bit better here. This is how well it's been working. SP, I bought another Stream Deck. I have now a Stream Deck Neo, which is a smaller one, but I wanted to give it a go because only challenge that I had was trying to find the hotkey to easily mark which edit marker that I wanted to put in because I have the descriptors in there. So I have one that it was easier. Yes, you can do multiple pages on Stream Decks and things like that, but on the fly, I wanted it just ready to go. I have a Stream Deck that's basically dedicated now, while streaming anyways, for editing, basically selecting the right edit marker. That's how well it worked for me last week, that I actually took advantage of a sale price on the Stream Deck Neo, have that there along with my other 2 Stream Decks. So now I've got an array of Stream Decks, which makes it so much easier, and plus the Stream Deck pedals. But anyways, it all works, and I'm very, very happy with the results.
Do you have an XL?
No, I don't, but in this case, I wouldn't want an XL for this purpose, other than dedicated. Sorry, I let me back up. I would choose an XL dedicated for editing, but I want a separate device for the edit markers so that it's easy just to know which device I'm going to look for the markers in. So
right.
Yeah, the XL could definitely work, but at this point I've slowly added. I don't really see a point in switching over since I already have these devices.
All right. We also had Suncast ask a question, and I'll throw this out there to our listeners. I actually have a recommendation, but don't know if it would work for him. He asked, out of curiosity, is there any other third-party podcast analytics service similar to PodTrack out there where it can pre-prend a URL to the URL for an MP3 to track info? Now, I don't know if this fits the bill for him, but there is such a thing as OP3, which is the Podcast Prefix Project, or Open Podcast Prefix Project. Your stats would be out there public, but it is a possibility to use. So why don't you, I don't know if you, Suncast, have looked into OP3 or not, but you might want to look into it to see if it would work. Outside of that, if anybody else has a recommendation for Suncast, please let us know, and come to the Discord server. He's in there as well. Just let him know. And I'd be curious to how this all works out as well, because I just get my stats from the podcast media host provider that I use, but I realize a lot of people use a third-party tracking service for whatever reason.
I know of a fruity alternative, but I'm not recommending it.
I would never recommend that.
So that's going to take us to the end of this show. Before we wrap up, we'd like to remind you can come to betterpodcasting.com for our back catalog, as well as betterpodcasting.com/Discord to chat with our awesome community. Let us know what you thought about today's discussion. We know it was a bit of a different one, but it was fun to reflect on the past and reflect on what the trends of the future might mean for you as a hobby podcaster. Are there any trends you thought we missed? Let us know at betterpodcasting.com/Discord, or find all of our contact over at betterpodcasting.com/contact. And while you are there, make sure you send an email over to SP telling him to buy a Stream Deck.
Maybe with holiday money, I'll be able to do that. By the way, next time we'll be delving into social media. So if you have any tips or tricks on how to use social media to your advantage in your hobby podcast, let us know. We'll talk about it next time.
So that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for episode number 307 of Better Podcasting. I'm Steven, saying we recorded this on a Saturday morning. It's been a while since I've done a podcast on a Saturday morning. Not sure how I feel.
I'm SP, saying it's always been Saturday afternoon since we started. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Time zones. Bye.
Thanks for checking out another episode of Better Podcasting. You can find the full back catalog of Better Podcasting at betterpodcasting.com. If you're into geeky podcasts, please check out the other podcasts on the Gonna Geek Network at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This show was produced and edited by Stephen Jondrew. Voice work was done by L.W. Salinas. Thanks again for listening or watching, and we hope to see you again next week.
All right, thanks everybody for coming on by and putting up with all these edits. Sorry about that. It is what it is. Yeah, you know, obviously if I was to buy now, probably would make sense to buy just an XL, and then the Neo would probably be fine for the edits. I slowly added through sales, so not really much point in replacing. Plus, I think the XL is a little overpriced, to be honest, but
yeah,
hopefully it'll come on sale.
Yeah, if I was going to do it, I would definitely wait for a sale in order to pick one up. And I want to say last holiday season, there was an incredible sale on it that was promoted in our Discord server.
That very well could be.
So if anybody else, I think Chris was the one who dropped it. So I'm trying to slowly stash some cash away for a Rodecaster Pro 2 replacement, but I haven't seen anything come out. And of course, Rode went all in with the video this year, so I don't know. We'll see if they ever do a audio only product again. I'll be disappointed if they don't, because I don't need. Here at home, I would never need the video switching capability.
So I'm not sure why the dual stream didn't work. I'm having a look here. I thought maybe it was the encoder, but no. The encoder to the vertical was on software, and software resources were very low. I looked at those right away. The total bit rates going out altogether don't stack up to be that much. I have a theory here. I'm wondering. No, that wouldn't be that. No, that's busted. I was going to say, I wonder if YouTube was having issues with going to do different channels from the same connection, but the one is going to restream, so I don't have a theory. So I'll have to have a look and see. But what was happening was it was alternating. I could see in the two control panels, the one would go offline while the other would come online. So I don't know what was going on with that. So that must point to an OBS issue. Now that I think about it, because with it being a connection to Restream and a connection directly to YouTube, there's no overlap there. The hardware encoders were different between the streaming out to the widescreen versus the vertical. It's got to have been something OBS.
Yeah, have you updated to the latest OBS?
Yes. I'm thinking there's probably some form of configuration conflict that they didn't like them. So I'll have to try again, but
if you revert back, can you revert back? Would it work, you think?
I don't know. I'll have to go. I'll go hunting through the vertical the GitHub issues and see what's on there.
Okay.
See if anybody's reported anything. But thanks everybody for coming on by. We hope you had yourself a fun time. We will let you know when the next one will be. Goodbye.
Bye.